Hello, everybody, and welcome to our annual Slesnick Symposium. I can't see you all, but I think that there are a large number of you out there, and this may very well be our largest ever Slesnick Symposium. One of the advantages of going online is to get a broader audience from broader places. So thank you for attending. I'm going to go ahead and start by acknowledging that although many of us are not in Bellingham, including our speaker, we all are thinking about the lands that we are on. And I'm going to go ahead and acknowledge the tribal lands that Western Washington University sits on. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that we gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And before we get started, I would like to just go through the logistics of the question asking for today's keynote talk. You should see a Q&A feature down by the chat feature. Please use that Q&A button at any time to ask a question. And then we will have a Q&A period at the end that's moderated using your questions. Okay, so before we get started, I would like to thank a few people. A lot of hard work went into organizing this symposium. Dr. Debbie Hannison chaired the committee that put this all together. And Shannon Warren, Ten Lay, Lori Torres, and Blanche Bybee also helped conceptualize and put together the nuts and bolts of today's program. So thank you all for all of your hard work. I'd also like to thank Janine Bangston from the Alumni Center, Director of Alumni Relations, who helped with the outreach of this program and helped put together the webinar. So thank you, Janine. And lastly, I'd like to thank Carol Slesnick, without whose support we would not have the Slesnick Fund or the Slesnick Symposium. So thank you very much to Carol for allowing us to put on these events every year. Okay, so I'd like to then introduce our speaker, and then he can get us started. Bryan Dewsbury, Professor Bryan Dewsbury, is an associate professor of biological sciences at the University of Rhode Island. He has a PhD in biology from Florida International University and a BS in biology from Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. He does a lot of work on equitable STEM instruction. For example, he is the principal investigator of the Science, Education, and Society, or SEAS, research program, and co-principal investigator of the Maximizing Access to Research Careers, or MARC, undergraduate student training and academic research program. He is a fellow of the John N. Gardner Institute, where he assists member institutions on the adoption of inclusive practices. And his research overall focuses on the social context of learning, and as you've heard, on faculty development on curriculum design as it pertains to inclusive practices. So he will be transitioning this summer to Florida International University in Miami, Florida, where he will be an associate professor of biology and associate director of the STEM Transformation Institute, where he will run the Division of Transformative Education. So really exciting, good work to be done there. And I would just like to, before bringing Bryan in for his talk, I asked him a little bit about his hobbies. His hobbies and interests include salsa dancing, hiking, learning about new cultures and lifestyles through travel and other things. And also he claims that Batman is the greatest DC superhero. So with that, I want to thank Bryan for coming and agreeing to share this time with us. And I really look forward to your talk, Bryan, and thank you.
Batman is the greatest superhero. I'm glad you included that. Well, greatest DC, all right, greatest DC. We won't get into any fights. Um, anyway, thanks, Emily. Thanks, Western Washington University, for the invitation. Every time I'm invited to a place is a humbling experience. I will say I'm glad that we live in an age where, you know, we have the Wi-Fi bandwidth to do these things on Zoom so we don't miss out. But I do miss being in places in person. You know, there is something about being on the ground and getting a sense for the culture and flavor of how people interact with each other and think about these questions that's a little missing on Zoom. I think you might agree with me on that. So if this goes well, I trust that one day you invite me to Bellingham. All right, just give me a second. Let me share my screen. So again, good afternoon. I want to talk to you about something over the next hour that in reality, we would need all day to talk about. And that's the trick, right? That's the trick and the struggle with this conversation in that we have limited time. And so what I want to promise you is that I will share a little bit of my experience, a little bit of my perspective on what this looks like and what this can be. But at the same time, I want to challenge you that understanding equity and inclusion in the classroom requires you to do more than just listen to me for this hour and even beyond tomorrow's workshop. Because I absolutely love teaching. I really do. I don't use that L word lightly, right? And the more I have conversations about equity and inclusion in the classroom, I've come to realize that we speak well-intentioned about transformation, about you know, we need to fix things and do certain things better and different. What we need to realize, though, is that we are trying to create something that hasn't existed yet. The inclusive classroom, in all its dimensions, hasn't really fully come to be. We've done elements, right? We've pulled in active learning. We are trying to address representation in textbooks and in faculty members. But that space where it all comes together and hits that sweet spot, we yet to get there. And I believe we will, but I need us to recognize where we are at. And to be honest, we cannot be very surprised. Think about it. If you wanted to be a doctor, you might be a STEM major, you go off to med school, you do residency, get a practice, go to the hospital, you become a doctor. If you wanted to be a lawyer, you will, you know, English major, political science major, go off to law school to be a lawyer. You want to teach a college classroom, you spend 6 to 10 years refining your skill set in a very, very narrow reductionist area of knowledge, become the world's expert in that one protein or part of one protein. And then you become a faculty member and then say, oh, by the way, there's a classroom you should teach. Please do not go around Western Washington telling people that Bryan came to our campus and said, we shouldn't be experts in what we teach. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that teaching is something more. And before we start talking about what should and shouldn't happen in the classroom, let's take a look at what happens before people even get to the classroom. Because to me, if institutions of higher education truly valued teaching as an actual skill set, that the principles we are going to talk about today and tomorrow are things that should be honed in and mastered, it would stand to reason that you would engage these things before you got your first faculty job. So it's not just a classroom issue, it's an ecosystem issue, right? There are other parts of the pathway that's broken. And until we put everything on the table, all of it, then we keep picking at the edges, picking at small parts. You know, we have a workshop here and a workshop there, and we have a conference and we talk about it and we all agree, but we're not doing a systemic change. So I break down the anatomy of the classroom in this paper I wrote a couple of years ago. And I'll be honest, I mean, I hope you get a chance to read it. I hope you enjoy it. But I didn't come up with anything new here, right? The people I've cited who've been talking about equity and inclusion and the cultivation of meaning and purpose as a core function of the classroom. That didn't start with Bryan Dewsbury, right? I am citing people who have deceased, who were central in the civil rights struggle, people who understood that humanity has to be the centerpiece of what's happening in that space. So the box you see in red that I call self-awareness and empathy is the relationships, refers to the relationships that you build with students before you get into, am I going to flip my classroom? Am I going to do active learning? Am I going to do group work? What am I going to cover? What's on the exam? Before we get to that, I want you to understand who you are, what biases you bring to this space, what your sense of why is, why do you teach, why does it matter to you? Because that is what you emit when you are in the classroom. That comes across when you engage students. And I want you to understand who your students are. Not just who they are, like what their name is and where they came from. I want you to understand that in America, what does it take for some people to get to a higher education classroom? Is that pathway equal for everyone? And if it's not, who is it not equal for and why? So when you start describing people's behaviors like, you know, underprepared and things like that, if you understand the context, you might use different language. So what I'm saying to you is that I don't really care how many clickers you use in your classroom. If the student's not spiritually and emotionally connected to that experience, it really doesn't matter. And we have to get away from this blind plug and play, give me 10 things I can do in my class for Monday type of approach to classroom transformation and really rejuvenate the whole system. So why do you teach? And I look, man, what is it, 7 years now? I've been a faculty member, grad student, 6.5 years before that. I understand how this works, right? I was in grad school too, particularly in STEM. And I've heard the language of, well, yeah, you know, if research doesn't happen for you, you could always teach. I've heard it. I've heard people who when I decided that I love teaching so much, I wanted to change my research focus to research and teaching. I've heard people say, but why would you do that? Anybody can do that. So I know that some of us, even, you know, I'm not saying people can't teach or not doing a good job. I know that many of us came into this space partly because it was assumed that if you got a PhD that could happen. Or if you have a research program, it's sort of a quid pro quo, right? In exchange for allowing me to have a research lab, you have to teach these couple of classes. And even the language we use around this, you know, reinforces that narrative, right? You get a course release as if it's an escape from Alcatraz or something. But I believe, my friends, that most of you and most faculty that I've had the pleasure of having this conversation with do not think in this way. You know, regardless of how people ended up in the classroom, I have to tell you, I'm hopeful. When I really get at what faculty members care about, you will find, as I've found, that most people truly want the best for their students. They may not know or may disagree on how to get there, but I haven't really met the faculty member who says, yeah, I'm just trying to give out as much Fs as possible. Like, I haven't met that person. So when I drill down and I ask questions like, if you met your student 10 years from now, 15 years from now, what kind of person do you hope they are? And they would talk about things like voters, like good neighbors, good people, good parents, critical consumers of information, civically engaged. Then when we get to faculty development, we want to talk about coverage and content and coverage and content and what to cover and what to cover. I repeat, I am not anti-content. I am a lover of content. But teaching is about something more. And the studies exist now that have shown us that when people look back at their undergraduate experience, what they remember is not the complementary base pairs of DNA. It's not the electron transport. You don't remember that. They're going to see that again. They could look that up. They remember the people who believed in them, the mentors. They remember the relationships they've formed. They remember the things they've created. The content is a vehicle. Let's stop giving it this much privilege. So what I want to do for the remainder of my time here is walk you through what the anatomy of an inclusive classroom looks like in my context. And I want to stress to you that this is my context. University of Rhode Island is not Western Washington University. Western Washington University is not Florida International University. Every university is different. We have different students. We have different faculty members. We have different governance systems depending, right? So I may say some things that hopefully are meaningful and useful for you, but what I hope to leave with you more than anything is the process by which I make the decisions that I make in my class. Inclusive teaching is a personal journey. It's a personal journey. Brian's story is not your story. My students are not your students. But there are things you can do to find out information on that journey that will inform the things that you do. And here is mine. All right. Don't want to bore you with too much details about my life, but you can probably tell from my accent that I was born in the Caribbean. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, which is the last two islands in the Caribbean archipelago. I came to the US for college, F1 visa. Didn't even really plan to stay initially, to be honest, but you know, life is what it is. And so 3 degrees later, here I am, right? And, you know, I got a chance to write about this some years ago, and there are many parts to the story. And if you do get a chance to read it, you'll see what I mean. But I want to highlight perhaps one thing, and that's this notion of identity. And this is part of the classroom's anatomy. What I bring to the classroom is part of that anatomy. I emit, you know, I emote whether I like it or not. I have nonverbals, whether I like it or not. You know, when I enter relationships with students, when I, you know, mentor them, et cetera, all of the variety, you know, varied things of my life impact how I approach that. And I am a person of color, but I was born and raised in a country with a very different social structure than the US. So when I came here at 19, intellectually, I understood that racism existed. But being a Black man in America is very different to being a Black man in Trinidad. I'm not saying Trinidad is perfect. I'm just saying it's different. So I have this interesting, intersectionality in my world where I identify as an immigrant, I identify as Trinidadian, I identify as a person of color, I identify as a professor. And depending on the context I'm in, I can be treated very, very differently. And that matters, honestly, in a very helpful way, because when I'm in the classroom, I understand exactly how so many of my first generation students feel. I understand exactly how my students of color feel. I'm not saying that you have to be a person of color to feel that way. I'm saying that's my story, right? So I know when studies come out and we talk about white and Black and Hispanic and other, no report, and we bunch people into these neat bins as though they only have one dimension to who they are. I understand what it means to have that multi-dimension. So I'm making no assumptions when, say, two students of color sit next to each other. What their experience has been to that point and what their experience will be in my class doesn't necessarily have to be the same just because a census is going to mark them as Black. I know that from my history. All right, let's hop on a plane now. I grew up in Trinidad. I moved from Trinidad to Atlanta. Atlanta was Morehouse College. Atlanta to Miami. Miami was Florida International University. And then from Miami, I went to New England, which is where I am now. I like New England very much. I really do. But the Miami to New England was actually the biggest culture shock of all of the trips. And, it took a while to fully understand it. I don't know how many of you have been to New England. It really is lovely here. So I'm actually not hating. But there was a little bit of sanctimony, right? This sense, people would talk about race in a way as if racism only happened like south of the Mason-Dixon line, right? And even if you took a glimpse at history, you'd realize how ridiculous that notion was. But there was an unwillingness to face up to that truth, right? So this map, for example, is it's a redlining map. In case you don't know what that is, let me catch you up. In the 1930s, the federal government is trying to get the US, I believe it was Roosevelt, trying to get the US economy back up on its feet, and is offering low interest or no interest loans for people to buy houses. Why? Because in this economy, a lot of people's personal equity lies within the house that they own, that house gets passed down, et cetera, et cetera. They commissioned a separate group called the Homeowners Loan Corporation to color code maps of major cities in the US based on desirability for lending. So if you're in the blue or the green zone, those are business owners or renters, I believe, not renters, like landowners, that was fine. Yellow was considered declining, and red was, as mostly where most Black and Hispanics live, were redlined. So you either got no loans at all, denied outright, or you got it at a very high interest rate. So understand this. This was policy until the mid-1960s, when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And as you know, the way these things work is a law gets passed, but it doesn't mean that, tomorrow everything, gets to be fair. So in a case of quote unquote unofficial redlining, a bank in Providence was found to have done this, and I'll just summarize this for you. They settled a lawsuit, a redlining lawsuit, alleging that they reduced lending in the minority neighborhoods while expanding its reach in white neighborhoods, never admitted to wrongdoing, but paid a fine, $1.3 million. This was 7 years ago. In the anatomy of the classroom, we have to do more work to understand who our students are. They don't walk into our classrooms as blank slates. They walk in with a history. And sometimes that history puts you in a great position to take advantage of all that the institutions of higher education have to offer. Sometimes that history means that you had to surmount a number of barriers just to be there, just to get to that first year of college. And those barriers, in many cases, such as the one you're looking at, could be for reasons that are completely out of the control of students. So I'm not saying to you, my friends, that you can solve years and years of redlining with one intro bio classroom. I'm saying that we can start to change our perspective about who our students are when they walk in. So yes, they walk into my classroom just like so many, with bad study skills, with underprepared, have not done a science class in 3 years. I know, but I know it's not their fault. And I'm not saying people can't be resilient, but having a mentality where I take as a given, you can do this. It is up to me to figure out how to get the brilliance that you already have out. That's my job. So it means I don't decrease the rigor of the classroom, but I can up the support structure. So then I have to try to get to know them as people. And that begins with having them reflect. I put the entire link here because it's such a beautiful prompt that I literally just copy paste from this website, right? And you should too. It's taxpayers' dollars. It's not plagiarism, damn it. Do it, all right? In summary, it says, describe the values that shape your deepest passions. I want them to look at their own history, good, bad, or in between. I want them to look at that and talk about what it means to be passionate about something. What does it really mean? And so they talk about divorces, they talk about marriages, they talk about Sunday dinner, they talk about burying parents from heroin, they talk about their dog. I mean, you'll be amazed because I get the sense that people actually haven't asked them those questions in the past. And one of the things that it becomes like an informational thing because they also talk about, I'm not really a science student, right? And so what that tells me is, you know, it's not that you're not a science student, it's that you haven't had good opportunities, good experiences in sciences up until this point. So in this intro bio class, it is my job to figure out how to get you to have success so that as you go forth in science, you have something you can refer to that will tell you you are very capable in this space. And that begins with the continuation of that dialogue. You know, people always ask about, you know, dialogue and they think about, yeah, you know, you have to meet with every student for 20 minutes, for 45 minutes. I teach 155 students. I can't do that. I meet with a lot of them. But dialogue comes from dia, which means through, and logos, which means meaning. It's not just a conversation. It's not just a relationship. It is a relationship that is seeking some kind of meaning. There's a point to this. So when we begin on that first day of class, my goal is that when you walk out to these doors in 3 months, you have grown. You have grown. So everything we do during that time is geared to support that growth. So dialogue doesn't necessarily have to be one-on-one. Dialogue is when I'm, you know, explaining something in class and mixing it with motivational speeches. Dialogue is when I'm emailing students back and forth. Dialogue is when I run into a student on the quad. Any interaction I have with a student is an opportunity for education to happen. So it's not just about Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 2 to 3. It's about whenever we're interacting. It's a community. You know, Elizabeth Mohay, she wrote a paper back in 1996, and the title I think is perfect. She says, I don't teach subjects, I teach students. And so the mindset of subjects is the content thing, right? Your job is to just come in and profess, come in and talk about just the things that you're an expert in. You know, one of my deans says, you know, he calls it teacher dissertation. Just talk about how great, I think you should, but that's only part of the job. If you're teaching students, you are thinking about the cultivation of the individual. That demands a whole different skill set. So you can probably gather that, you can probably gather that my classroom is, it's a lot of moving parts. we have a lot of fun. I mean, I'll be honest with you, we have a lot of fun. And we'll be here all day if I had to kind of go through all the 100 things that we did. But I just want to highlight two things here, because I think it really speaks to how the way we dissect the classroom matters, and how what we do in response to that dissection, how we respond to that dissection in a particular way, all right? One thing is what we call opportunities for dialogue, which quite frankly, most other people call group work. Dialogue in this case, my friends, is dialogue between the students. I teach an intro bio classroom. And yes, I do group work. I put them in groups. I socially engineer the groups. So I make it ethnically mixed. I make it mixed based on high schools, stated gender, things like that. And I'm thinking very carefully about what they're doing in that group. So this is not just a case of gather together and go do a bunch of Punnett squares. This is, I want you to learn how to interact and have difficult dialogues over really critical but meaningful issues. So yes, we talk about DNA structure, but in their groups, they talk about a case study with Rosalind Franklin and the theft of her data. Yes, we talk about cancer and P53 and the cell cycle, but in a group, they discuss Henrietta Lacks. Yes, we talk about evolution and natural selection and its principles, but in a group, they talk about eugenics in California and the American Breeders Association. Because what we tend to do in STEM is we outsource the equity conversation to Hispanic Heritage Month. We wait for MLK breakfast we believe in King's message. We have to get more sophisticated than that. Because if you're really thinking about who you want your students to be 10, 15 years from now, what you want is for them to be able to engage in difficult concepts, difficult conversations with people who think differently, respectfully. Because that's what they remember when they leave your classroom. So what better space there is to develop that skill than within a discipline itself? Why wait for them to take a genetic class in African American studies to talk about race, when the biology of race has so much to teach us about how socially constructed this is? That's a choice. That's a choice we have to make. The second thing is this notion of office hours, which perhaps every university calls it that. In my class, we actually call it student hours or the learning lounge, which is cheesy, I know, but deal with it. And I'll tell you why. I'm a first generation college student. And if some of you are, or if you had the privilege of teaching first generation students, we are a very interesting species. I mean, when I was in undergrad, I didn't even know that was a term. But the key is when you're first gen, you don't have access to the hidden curriculum. So you play by the rules, you're often conservative, and when you don't know things like it's okay to go and talk to professors and volunteer in research labs, and you kind of do your work, get a GPA, things will happen, right? And in the absence of that knowledge of the hidden curriculum, first generation students come up with all these weird ways of how they think college works. So I have actually had students tell me that they thought office hours was when the professor got to check their email. And yeah, I know. I mean, I know you're on webinar and I can't hear you, but I'm pretty sure you're gasping at that. So there's that. But then there's also cultural issues. For a lot of my first year students, this notion of coming to, what would be called office hours is like walking the green mile. Like we put so much work in my class to just changing the language about what it means to go to tutoring and what it means to come to student hours, what it means to go to the learning assistants, right? We actually don't even really use the word help. I will say things like, this is a very technical subject. Some of the language that you will see in this textbook, some of the language we'll use, you would have heard for the first time. And it is very natural in that case for you to need repeated exposure in order to feel comfortable discussing this on your own. So coming to student hours and going to tutoring and seeing the learning assistants provides that repeated exposure that can be very helpful. That is a very different way of describing it than, yeah, if you don't get it, you can go to that room after 6 p.m. So we have student hours, we call it student hours. It's held in the dorms. Why? Because my office has 2 chairs and I teach 200 students, 155 actually. The basement of the dorm has a classroom with 5 whiteboards. We average 40 students a week. We offer it at different times so that people who are working and have conflicting classes, everybody gets a chance to come. And the students who are doing well, they come too. And I ask them to say, okay, all right, Emily, you really understand this. So I want you to make sure this group gets it as well as you do. And those are the students who end up becoming my learning assistants. We build community. So when I started back in 2014, there were 3 sections of this class. And it was almost a given that the average DFW, these Fs and withdrawal, I should say unproductive grade rate. So you have to get a C or above to move on to the second semester of the class, right? It was a given that the unproductive rate was 30 to 35%. Underrepresented students were getting that, having unproductive grades about 2-3 times the rate of white students. Our first semester, which was section 4, we were no better. And one of the critical decisions we made was that if you're really going to do inclusive practices, we have to sacrifice content because we are teaching students and not subjects. And so really digging into what content was necessary, what skills we really wanted to happen, and trusting that if we taught them how to learn on their own, a lot of what was in the book they could actually do on their own, right? By the very next fall, we wiped out any kind of academic outcome gaps, right? And just lowered the overall unproductive rate to less than 10%, remained that way ever since, right? But as you can imagine, the pushback was, well, Bryan, if you're not gonna tell them, if you're not going to have them memorize every single amino acid, then, clearly they'll do better. It's like, all right. Because after 1 year of intro bio, they're going to go on to upper division courses, where presumably, if I was really messing this up, they would all fall flat on their face, right? So we looked at 4 groups of students. Hear me out here, right? The first semester has 4 sections. The second semester has 2 sections of intro bio 2, right? In the first semester, the 3 sections are teaching in the very conventional, high stakes, 4 exams, no quizzes, none of that stuff. And then there's me, who's doing what I'm calling inclusive teaching, right? In the second semester, you have two sections. One is like me, very inclusive, and the other is very conventional. So if you are a student matriculating through this pathway, you will either have, listen to me, 1 full year of inclusive instruction, group 1, 1 full year of a conventional experience, group 2, 1 semester of inclusive instruction, group 3, or the just the second semester of inclusive instruction, group 4. All right. And what we looked at was the average grade in the 200 level class. So on the vertical axis, that 4.0 is an A, 3 is a B, 2 is a C, right? B is just the one semester, just the first semester. That's B for Bryan. BS is initials, not what you normally use that for. That's the full year of inclusion. S is just the second semester, and C is neither, right? So 40% less content, and they're actually doing better in that 200 level class than if you had a year of no inclusive instruction. No, they didn't have to memorize all the amino acids. If you trust that you can teach them how to learn on their own, look, even if these points were actually at the same height, I can tell you, look, we did less material and they're doing just as well. Why are you killing yourself trying to cover 50 chapters? I want to close by pointing out a group of special students who really set me on my journey to what I do for a living now, and the kinds of questions that I ask, and the way in which I view my classroom. As Emily said, I did my PhD in biology. More specifically, it was in marine biology, and I did seagrass ecosystem ecology, if you want to get that specific. And it was fun. I had a great time. I really, South Florida is a great place to do marine work. But I was there was a culture, a STEM graduate culture that, people would explicitly say to me that, what you do is you avoid teaching as much as you can as a grad student, because that's not what you're here for. And for a while I did, during my master's I did. But when I started to teach as a PhD student, I was terrible. I was really terrible. But I was teaching students who were first generation Americans, first generation college students. And we do labs, and you know how labs are. There's a lot of downtime. You're running something. This is ecology lab, but there's a lot of time to talk in between. And we would talk to them, and I would ask them, like, why are you pre-med? And not in an accusing way, but just interested. Like, why pre-med as opposed to all the other things you could do as a scientist? And they would tell me, look, man, I come from an extended family. They told me that I have to be a doctor because, they're counting on my career getting into the 6 figures in order for everybody to have a better life. Some would tell me I like science, so therefore I want to be a vet. and the more I would talk to them, the more I would realize that we had this entire degree for them planned out that had nothing to do with how they saw life and what they thought they should be getting from it. So it became this completely utilitarian, transactional process. I'm here for that grade because that grade is getting me to that step. And the faculty would be frustrated, all these pre-med kids that just want to check a box. Yes, they want to check a box, but you haven't asked them why. And when I heard these stories, me and a couple of grad students, we redesigned the entire curriculum for a separate program that we got some funding for, and we had some beautiful results. And they taught me once and for all that when I'm in that classroom, my job is not to be the superstar, to impress them. My job is to listen and figure out what it is they need to be excellent and teach to that. So sometimes we want to find the books and the strategies and the tips and everything. And I'm not actually against that stuff, right? I use it in workshops. We'll talk about some of that tomorrow. But sometimes the best data that you could get is sitting right in front of you. And you just have to have the kind of pedagogy where you ask. So the question is not so much what shall you teach, because people like Bryan come along and talk about inclusion and equity, and we've all been trained as physicists and marine chemists. And I'm trying to get our discipline away from the what and more to the who. Because the anatomy of the class, in the anatomy of the classroom, you and your students are its two most critical components. So if we don't spend time understanding that, honestly, any inclusive approach will be more or less a band-aid. So I'll stop there for today. We have a little bit of time for questions, I believe. But if I don't, if we don't get to talk now or tomorrow, just leaving my contact information here. Feel free to reach out whenever. These are conversations I clearly enjoy having. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see some of you tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. So Bryan mentioned we do have some time for questions, and I have a couple of things that came up in the Q&A, so feel free to add more there. So Bryan, one question that I have for you is, you described kind of your idea of what your job is, and you're conceptualizing that very differently, I think, than many teachers do. And so I'm wondering, what kinds of barriers have you encountered career-wise with the reward systems or evaluation systems for how you're conceptualizing your job as a teacher, and what advice would you give to other faculty, particularly pre-tenure faculty and faculty who are tenured, who could advocate for folks in regard to conceptualizing your position as a teacher?
Yeah, that's a good question, Debbie. I'll focus on the pre-tenure part, because it seems like that's where the question is mostly focused on, because there's a whole grad school part, and that was its own interesting challenge. I want to be very careful here, because I'm Bryan, and I can make decisions for myself and my family based on my circumstance, and I think it would be unfair of me to say, to ask people to make the same decisions I made, because I don't know what your risk factor is. I don't know what you might be willing to walk away from if things don't work. But I do urge you to figure that calculus out, right? Figure out how tied you are to a position, its salary, location, all of those things. I don't want to paint a doomsday scenario, but I think we have to bring that, in all honesty, to the table. Because quite frankly, when I was an assistant professor, some of the well-meaning advice I used to get in the early years was, just put your head down, just get tenure. Your job is to get tenure. How is getting tenure a job? That makes absolutely no sense. It makes no sense. Like, if you think about it, it makes no sense. What tenure actually is an assessment structure that says, based on these particular rubrics, which are usually poorly defined, right? We will now grant you a promotion and permanent employment, whatever, right? But what happens is, sometimes the assessment tool gets divorced from the thing it's assessing. So look at, ask me, how is teaching really being measured? How is your research being measured? How is your committee work? How is your diversity, equity, and inclusion work being considered? And when it gets divorced, because the hyper focus is on the tool becomes the job. So just get tenure becomes the job. I'm saying, no. My job is to be excellent in the classroom and to do interesting things with my research program and build a national profile. That's the job. So if we're going to put this package together over the 6 years in this particular way, and I was very transparent with everyone, this is what it's going to look like. There's going to be, papers and things that we write, but there's going to be podcasts, there's going to be media, there's going to be faculty development, because what we care about is the question, not tenure. We care about the question. The job gives me the space to address the question. But I'm saying this to the person who asked the question. This is how I was raised. I don't do plantation politics very well, right? I don't do the like hop and skip, and I see the whole thing coming down, right? Because people get there, you get the salary, then you buy a house, you buy a mortgage, and so now everything's tied to you keeping the job. So you have to like do whatever to get tenure, because God forbid you lose your mortgage, your kids have to go to college. It's a really, really tough ecosystem. So I want to ask the person who asked the question, Debbie, to take a few steps back and ask yourself what's important to you in your career. Yes, it may be that frog that you're researching, but if issues of diversity and equity are important to you, I want to encourage you to find ways to bring that into your research program, into your service work, into your, and not just local service work, like your national work, and try to be transparent with chairs and deans about this is a desire you want, and see how that is perceived at your institution. And depending on the response, you may have some decisions to make. I hate to be dark, but I feel I have to be real at the same time, right? So thanks for asking.
Great. So along the lines of sharing your work and what that looks like, we did have a question about whether you have published or maybe podcasted some of the comparisons of the student success data that you shared with us. And if so, where can people access that?
The data I just showed you is currently in review. Provided reviewers get back to me in a timely fashion, I expect that to be out probably midsummer. Yeah. So it's in review. Yeah.
Okay, we have one more comment that maybe you can elaborate on this as well, about your comments about office hours and drop-in hours. And so I'll just give you an opportunity to expand on other kind of similar practices like that you've found transformative. I know you mentioned earlier that when you started off as a professor, you were terrible. So I'm guessing you've learned some things along the way, and what are some of those similar to the office hours that you discussed?
Well, I'll bring up one other, and this is the assessment structure that I use. The thing with intro bio, this class I'm using as an example, just because it's so predictive. It can be so predictive of how students experience the rest of their science major. Intro bio is more intro than its bio. Like it's more about the intro than the bio. Honestly, once students, figure out they can do it, they're comfortable with the language, they can believe in themselves. The bio part is not really that hard. Like it really is not. It's funny, it's weird to see them make it hard. Like, see, they look at the page with all the gene numbers and it looks all, and they make it hard. Like it looks hard. But once they get that comfort level up, it's not that hard, right? So what I tend to be dealing with, and especially in the first month of class, are all the issues relating to transition. It's all the social belonging, it's all the fixed mindset, it's all the identity struggles, it's all the things like making friends, and they hear one student in the class answer a question and it suddenly means that they are stupid and they don't know any, like it's psychological. So what you want to do in that intro class is you want to create an assessment structure that doesn't punish them for a psychological contingency. This is why it's important for me not to have a first exam that's like, 25% or 30%. Because if somebody is struggling with social belonging and they feel that because of that, am I really testing their ability to do science? No. I'm weeding out people who came from some of those communities I described earlier. And for a variety of reasons, that onboarding is tough. So to answer the question more directly, at the end of 3.5 weeks, right? I have one major exam, which is 15%, 15% of the final grade. About 4 quizzes would have happened, and those average out to like 10%. I mean, there's more that comes, but there's a group assignment, there's a peer evaluation, so there's a bunch of different things, right? So if you were to take the exam, for example, it's out of 50 points. So you can actually get 25 out of 50, which is terrible, and only lose 7.5% of your final grade. And that's done on purpose because I want the exam to be high stakes enough that you do take it seriously, that you prepare for it, we want to, and we want to actually assess if you understand, if you're able to communicate in the way that we've been training you to. We want that to happen, but we don't want it to be so high that if you still have some work to do in that area, you are so far back grade-wise that it's basically like climbing up a vertical mountain to even pass the class. So now the assessment is set up that whatever happens, we can have a conversation. The last question on the exam is, predict your score out of 50. That's the last question. And yes, everybody predicts. And for those of you who want to do the stats, the R squared is like 8%, right? So people say, I'm going to get 45 to get a 30, right? The R squared increases as the semester goes on, thankfully, right? But invariably, that first exam, people over predict what they're going to get. And then I regress the predicted versus the actual, and I show them the graph in class. Obviously, I remove the names and stuff. And so we talk about, what does it mean to really know something, right? What does it mean to go in an exam and be fully confident that whatever I ask you, you can communicate an analysis to me without fear of it being incorrect or, having that confidence. And I look at the bottom, like 30, 40% of my roster, and I call them in for one-on-one meetings. And by call, I mean call, right? Because I email, some might respond, email 2-3 times, then I call a cell phone. In some cases, I'll knock on a door. Like, I get everybody in there for a one-on-one meeting. And then we have a conversation that typically goes like this. So you thought you were going to get a 43, got a 30. Where do you think those 13 points went? I don't know, professor. I studied really, really hard. All right, well, I have no doubt you studied hard. I know you're really a hard worker. Tell me what you did when you studied. Well, I was up in the library until 2 a.m. You just told me how long you were up. You didn't tell me what you did. So walk me through the moment you sat down to when you decided you were done, right? And the reason why you have to get that specific is because if you don't give them a strategy or identify something that's changeable, they will double down on the same bad habits just 10 times as hard for the next exam. So I can't just...
So I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because we are at time, but I'm already wanting to pick your head more, pick your brain more about the assessment here. And I think other people are enjoying it as well too. So I'm sad to kind of call time here.
No problem.
But I do want to ask everyone to please join me in a virtual round of applause for our speaker, Dr. Bryan Dewsbury. On behalf of the SMATE program and all of Western Washington University, thank you for joining us today. Thank you especially to the Western Washington University Alumni Association for their partnership, and those of you who chose to support the Irwin L. Slesnick Symposium when you registered for this webinar. We are so thankful for the legacy and impact that Dr. Slesnick has made on our program and beyond. And we look forward to seeing many of you at Dr. Dewsbury's workshop tomorrow. Please check your email an hour before the workshop for updated Zoom login information. The recording of tonight's keynote will be available next week and will be sent out via email to all attendees.
Thanks, everyone.